Hi there, Brett Hornby here with a Calgary Sports video update, and I'm all decked out in my Calgary Stampeders gear because today we're talking about the history of the Grey Cup, but more specifically the big game being played right here in Calgary. There's been rumors online for months that the 107th Grey Cup was coming Calgary's way, and you'd figure after a decade it's due to happen with the 9 teams in the league right now. And on Wednesday, April the 25th, indeed, the CFL announced that Calgary will be hosting the 107th Grey Cup, which will be played on Sunday, November 24th, right at McMahon Stadium. And in some way, in default, Calgary was the only bidder that was able to bid for the game. Hamilton also did put a bid in for the game, but they apparently still have legal issues with the who owes what and construction delays that happened when they built the Tim Hortons field there a couple years ago. And then Saskatchewan said that they did not put a bid in for the big game for 2019. So Calgary was the only choice in the matter. As a season ticket holder, I can't be more thrilled knowing that the big game is coming back to Calgary. And in fact, my first 2 Grey Cup games that I took in live were right here in Calgary. And I'll be pulling out my notes here to briefly go over the history of the Grey Cup that happened right here in Calgary. So I'll grab my notes right here. So 2019 will be the first time that Calgary has hosted the Grey Cup in a decade, and it'll be the 5th time overall that the big game is played right here in Calgary. The first time it happened was in 1975. That was the 63rd Grey Cup, which featured the Edmonton Eskimos and the Montreal Alouettes. That year, the Edmonton Eskimos beat the Montreal Alouettes 9-8. Coming in that game, Edmonton was 12-4. Back then, they played only 16 games a season, and the Montreal Alouettes were 9-7. And this game happened on Sunday, November 23rd. And overall, including after 1975, this is the 11th time that both the Edmonton Eskimos and the Montreal Alouettes played for the Grey Cup. Some tidbits from this game that I found online, as I found interesting tidbits just quickly on Wikipedia for each game, that the attendance at the 1975 Grey Cup was 32,454. And interestingly, they mentioned that during the coin toss, a young woman went out streaking. I wonder what sight that was like, but can only imagine what would happen if someone went out streaking during the coin toss, which you don't see that happen very often. And also, I think there was a Chinook. This was before my time, but I believe there was a Chinook that rolled in the city leading into the Grey Cup, and both teams were packing accordingly. But then during the game, it was cold and windy and minus 15, and I believe the players were also stunned by the cold weather and the change of events, because they highlighted that. And I believe on TSN they had a top 10 on weather games, and they highlighted the 1975 Grey Cup on how both teams were shocked and unprepared for the sudden change in temperature, which is common here in Alberta, to have Chinooks coming in the winter where you get a sudden rise in temperature with the warm wind from the west, and sometimes you can get a big drop in temperature. And the other thing interesting about this game is that with the low score of 9-8, no touchdowns were scored that game. This is the first time in the modern era, and they declared the modern era CFL from 1954 on, that no touchdowns were scored in this game. The only other times that happened was the 21st and 25th Grey Cups. So interesting. Who knows, it could happen again down the road, but this was the first time in the modern era that no touchdowns were scored during the Grey Cup. And this was also the first time both the Grey Cup game was held in Calgary and in the province of Alberta. The second time that Calgary hosted the Grey Cup was in 1993, which was the 81st Grey Cup at that time. And this time it featured the Edmonton Eskimos and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. That year, the Edmonton Eskimos were 12-6, and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers were 14-4. And that game happened on Sunday, November the 28th. And the attendance at that game was 50,035, which I believe they had both temporary stands on the north and south ends, and that was the only time that was happened during the history of the Grey Cup in McMahon Stadium, because as I'll mention in the later games, they didn't build as many temporary stands. But getting back to the 1993 Grey Cup, the MVP of that game, I didn't mention any MVP or top Canadian or any halftime acts for the first Grey Cup, but I think those didn't come in until later. But the MVP for the 1993 Grey Cup, the 81st, was quarterback Damon Allen and kicker Sean Fleming, both with the Edmonton Eskimos. And Sean Fleming tied a record for a Grey Cup record with 6 field goals that game. Unlike the Grey Cup in 1975, and I actually do remember the Western Final the week before, where sadly the Calgary Stampeders lost to the Edmonton Eskimos. It was minus 20 and blizzardy, but then the following week it was plus 6 at game time, so it was a much warmer, more comfortable game for the fans and the players compared to 1975 or the Western Final for the Edmonton Eskimos. The other thing to note to that game is Winnipeg turned the ball over 7 times, so they definitely had a bad game considering they were favorites. And Edmonton scored 23 points off of those turnovers, so more often than not, if you have more turnovers, you likely won't win the football game. And at that time, no, Matt Dunnigan was behind center for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers because he had an Achilles tendon, so he didn't get to play that game. So that was another factor. And then before every Grey Cup, they introduced the officiating crew, and then they have an alternate crew. Well, at that time, Dave Yule, who was the referee at the time, actually ruptured his calf muscle in the second quarter. So Ken Lazarick had to come in. So that's interesting tidbits that was highlighted about the 81st Grey Cup in 1993 in Calgary. And I was 10 at the time, and I turned 11 actually, and I do remember that Calgary was excited for the Grey Cup, and there were banners everywhere, there were paint on the local businesses. It was almost like the Stampede like they do every year, where you see banners and painted ads, so the city was definitely excited about hosting the Grey Cup, the second one in Calgary history. And now let's move on to the third one, which happened in the year 2000, which was the 88th Grey Cup. That year, it featured the BC Lions and the Montreal Alouettes, and that happened on Sunday, November the 26th. That year, the BC Lions were 8-10, and the Montreal Alouettes were 12-6. And you had another major upset here, where the BC Lions beat the Montreal Alouettes 28-26, which this was the first time until the Calgary Stampeders in 2001, hence this year, was the first sub-500 team to win the championship. So it was definitely a major upset win for the BC Lions that year. Other tidbits from that game was the attendance of that game was 43,822. And I remember being a season ticket holder since I've been a season ticket holder from 1997, that they only built temporary stands on the north end, both for this game and the next game, hence the lower attendance, but they still sold out the game, which blocks out the red and white club. If you're familiar with McMahon Stadium, where you have the east and west stands, the north end had all the temporary stands in. And I also highlighted that the Guess Who, so I got to see the Guess Who live at halftime with Burton Cummings' Winnipeg product. And the MVP and the Canadian both were Lions. The MVP was Robert Drummond, and the Canadian was Sean Millington, which leads into the next tidbit that the BC Lions won that game big on their running game, as the Lions in total had 264 yards rushing, and that was enough to keep the Lions on the field and counteract with Montreal's passing attack, because they still had a younger Anthony Calvillo and Ben Cahoon that year. And also the other thing I remember from that game, and it was huge a lot of BC fans and a lot of CFL fans that this was the final game for legendary kicker Louis Bisaglia, so a lot of people were cheering for the Lions for that as well. And this was also the first appearance for the modern Montreal Alouettes, because in 1986 the Alouettes folded, and then the original Alouettes were also the Concords back then, but this was the first time that the Montreal Alouettes, the resurgent, where they moved from the Baltimore Stallions, got back into the Grey Cup. And then, as I mentioned at the top, this is the first team, the BC Lions of 2000, that they were the first sub-500 team to win the Grey Cup by having an 8-10 regular season. Now, the last Grey Cup that was played in Calgary was in 2009, the 97th Grey Cup, and it happened on Sunday, November 29th. Me personally, this was the second Grey Cup that I attended live, and it featured the Montreal Alouettes, who were 15-3 during that season, and the Saskatchewan Roughriders, who were 10-7-1 that season. And ultimately, the Montreal Alouettes won that game 28-27. And there were definitely a lot of storylines and interesting tidbits for this game that you may or may not fondly remember, depending on which kind of fan you are. But anyway, the first tidbit was the attendance of that game had 46,020. Once again, they only built the temporary stands in the north end zone, and that game definitely sold out. And given how rabid Rider fans are, it was almost a home game for the Saskatchewan Roughriders. So if Calgary wasn't in it from a Grey Cup community's point of view, it was also a success because you almost had the second home team in it, given that a quarter of Calgary's population comes from Saskatchewan. So win-win either way for the festivals and the stadium for how many tickets are sold. Halftime, I got to see Blue Rodeo. They're kind of a country act. And the MVP was Avon Coburn from Montreal, and receiver Ben Cahoon got top Canadian. Mostly they came to life in the fourth quarter, which kind of gets forgotten with that game. And also, this is the first time that both the Montreal Alouettes and the Saskatchewan Roughriders met in the Grey Cup. I know if you go back in the past, you had the Montreal Alouettes and the Regina Roughriders. They met from the Grey Cup, but this is in the modern era. This is the first time you had a Montreal and Saskatchewan Grey Cup. And at that time, this was also the 17th time that both teams have played in the Grey Cup, which is interesting, you can say. And let's get to the interesting parts about this game. Is this game will always forever be known as the Too Many Men game, where Montreal had a 43-yard field goal attempt, and they looked like they were going to win the game on a field goal. And I guess Saskatchewan, they had a different special teams crew to come in for a block. And what happened was that the field goal went wide. Saskatchewan received the field goal and run it out, and they thought they won the game. But unfortunately, they had too many men on the field, which gave David Duval, the kicker for the Montreal Alouettes, a second chance to kick a 33-yard field goal, and they went through the uprights and won the Grey Cup 28-27, which that would be the main storyline that most people remember that game. But the other thing I can remember from that game is the fact that Saskatchewan looked like they were going to pull off the upset and win the big game, and at one point they were up 27-11 with 8 minutes to go, and Anthony Calvillo, with his veteran poise, was able to chip away at the lead, and Montreal came back and they were marching down the field, which led to the field goal attempt, and ultimately they won it that way. So I say that should get some credit too, with obviously the Too Many Men and Rider Nation being devastated. But I wasn't, as a Stampeder fan, I didn't mind it, but that's what people remember that game for. But now, who knows what the 107th Grey Cup in 2019 has in store. As a Stampeder fan, I'm obviously excited for it, and I've had this dream before, but I'm dare dreaming again that Calgary will be in it and not only get into the Grey Cup, but be on the right side and win it this year. As in the last couple of years, they unfortunately lost it, won in overtime, and some fans were sympathizing with me when I was in Ottawa last year, that thinking I might not, they know how I felt, but I still think Rider fans were more heartbroken than I was in Ottawa, considering the last 4 minutes fell apart for the game last year. But I say in both every year, 93, 2000, 2009, Calgary was in the Western Final, and they had great teams that year, and fortunately they couldn't close the deal in the Western Final to get to the Grey Cup to play at home, but maybe this fourth time would be the charm, as they say. Anyway, if you enjoy my my video on how I feel about the Grey Cup being right here in Calgary, I can't be any more excited, and I just love the fact that I could stay home for the Grey Cup in 2019. Because personally, I went, my first two Grey Cups was 2000, 2009, and then my third Grey Cup, I went to the 102nd Grey Cup in Vancouver, which I got to watch my team win it live, and then I went to the 103rd Grey Cup, which was the first year Shaw was the main sponsor in Winnipeg, and Edmonton won that Grey Cup over Ottawa, and then I wasn't able to go to the game in Toronto and the 104th in 2016, but then obviously, as I just mentioned, I went to the 105th Grey Cup last year in Ottawa for Canada 150, where Toronto beat Calgary at that Grey Cup, so that's 5, and then I already got my ticket claimed for the Grey Cup up in Edmonton this year, the 106th Grey Cup, and I have my ticket, everything all booked, so I'm looking forward to that, which leads into the final point, that when the Calgary hosted the Grey Cup in 2009, Edmonton hosted it the next year in 2010, which at that time was the 98th Grey Cup. So in some way we're going to have another friendly Alberta, Battle of Alberta, as Calgary and Edmonton always seems to be battling for supremacy and pride, that Edmonton hosting the Grey Cup this year, the 106th, followed by the 107th Grey Cup here in Calgary in 2019. So we'll see who outdoes each other in the Grey Cup festivities and fun. So anyway, if you enjoy this video, hit like and subscribe. You're plenty of the way through, and I'll see you in the next video.